Which tab is the one is made up?
Which one?
Oh. You can go to the agenda and click it.
I think it's, yeah, just open this one. Okay. To make it bigger.
There's no present on the dock right yet. Is that big enough?
Is it big enough for you guys?
It's big enough for me.
Okay, that's better.
Well, it's good. So I guess this is some kind of long overdue improvement we want to make for the authentication policy. We want to try to fix few problems. One is, mostly it's about usability. We want to make it align better with the Kubernetes way or the standard way to specify, for example, the workload selector. We want to make the way to say when to apply which authentication policy easier to understand and more flexible. For example, for today, we have like job, define where to activate job based on path, but it's like deep inside the job definition by itself. We want to make it, easier to extend for new authentication method coming along, like RC token, support general TOS, so that we can use that for gateway as well, if possible. And in order to do that, we want to make, not define the methods inline as a policy, but like define in a separate place and refer them so that, the policy looks shorter and more focused on when to which method will be activated. So basically, that is the motivation for us to make this change. And so a lot of detail already discussed it in the previous design review or in other discussion. You can read more in the appendix. There are a list of docs that this discussion based on. On this design, I mainly highlight, stay at the high level of the overall structure of the policy and how they, work together. So first about the workload selector, we kind of agree on using the labels for workload selector. So it's aligned with the way we define service or define other networking policy in Istio. The rules will still contain two parts, P and origin. We may consider rename the name, but for now, just stay with whatever we have today. So P is about service-to-service authentication, and origin is like end user or device or like the one who makes the call or the request authentication, put it that way. But we change the structure of the thing under this. So the methods now contain, or the rule now contain a match block which specifies the condition when the methods will be activated, and then follow with the method definitions that could be referred by name. We come back to that shortly. Actually, come back to that right now. So the methods, we can define them in a separate CRD. Let's call it authentication methods. It contains the information we had. As for today, if you look at the authentication policy, you have to define, job with all the issuer, EOR, the job EOR, etc. And it's hard to reuse. So we think of like define this in separate place, and in the policy, you just refer them by name. For example, what we show here is I just call using Istio MTOS or using Acme job, etc., etc. Of course, we also think of keeping the inline options, so user can still define them in the policy if they want to. That could be useful in the case that they just have that method defined in only one service and not intend to share. But that is the, it's just additional option. We keep them open.
Question.
Yes.
So the peers are for authenticating the direct peer, right?
Yes.
And the origins is to authenticate the origin of the call.
Yes.
Is it possible to put Acme jot in the peers?
So in terms of policy, it's possible,
Sure.
right? Because right now the plan is using the same protocol for both of them, so we can refer to any name or refer to any line. In terms of implementations, we may not support them right away, but it's possible. So it have to depend on the context, right? If you're using JOT, that means it requires like maybe X509 JOT type, not the other type of.
So you want to use JOT to represent the peers.
The peer, yes.
So so it's just like we don't have the back-end support for that yet. But in terms of the language, we may be able to do both of them.
So now what you are presenting here as the example is only the case that we support.
Yes.
I see.
And that's why we want to unify this one, so that when you add a new method, you don't have to change a lot of structure around the code base. The scope is about where the let me try to remember what it is. So the scope is about what is the workload that the policy can affect it on. So today we have mesh policy that define cluster scope and intend to apply for every policy, all the workload or all the service in the mesh. We have a namespace wide which defines the namespace scope CRD and doesn't have any selector. And we call service specific, which you have a selector or we have a target define which specific service you want to apply on. So for this, we're going to keep the same hierarchy, except the mesh-wide policy will be in the root namespace instead of the cluster scope CRD. This is the direction that all other policy going to, so we just follow the trend.
Will their mesh policy override their
Yes, so I come to that in the very next sessions, overriding rule.
Okay.
So again, we keep it at ease as of today that the most specific scope will override the one above it. So if you define a service specific or workload specific policy, then that one will be used instead of the namespace or mesh wide if that's available. We know there is a demand that you want to reinforce the other way, right? So you want to have the organization define the mesh-wide policy and prevent anyone else to override that. So I think we're not trying to solve that today because there could be like a couple of options to doing so. One is you have the separate ICO way to prevent who can set what field in the policy or who can actually writing a new policy, or we can add a new flag, new field in the policy to say what can be overridden or who can be overridden.
But if you already have this, mechanism, service level override the namespace level, how do you prevent mesh level policy being overridden?
So we can simply solution, we can add a new field in the thing to say who can override that, right? As an opt-in.
Yeah. So why can't you just?
Who cannot override actually?
So why can't you just from now you can say mesh level policy is not allowed to overridden unless it's explicitly allowed.
So you can put that field. As I say, you can add that thing later in the spec to say this cannot overridden, or we can add some other external ICO model to prevent someone set this policy in the namespace.
Yeah, but if you introduce in the future, we need to consider backwards compatibility, not breaking the current policy. Like,
So the flag SSC will be add on later. So the default will be the workload overrides the namespace. That is what we have today. So I don't want to change that spec. And the new field will be, and you add a new field that will be prevent that to happen. So that will be have to be explicit. So if you define a mesh policy and you say not overridable, then the service specific policy be ignored when the flag when it's
Are you
received.
so my point is, why don't we do it today? Like,
I think
if
his
we do
point
it
is,
today, it's easier to.
it's already in maybe V1 or the legacy system is already in that way.
Breaking the current thing more, and I don't. I mean, I see the demand on both. I see the demand on this side more than the demand on the organization side more.
Like the service level.
Yeah.
But
because
basically, it means the service admin can override whatever mesh admin define.
Because they're controlling that.
I think it's highly preferable to introduce a new flag to say this policy cannot be overridden on the mesh level.
Yes. So we can add that.
Or maybe in the namespace level as well, because you have 3 levels, right?
So actually, the namespace is kind of the lazy part. It's not really a separate level because service specific. I mean, the namespace admin able to change both namespace and service specific. So
basically, it's 2 level. Namespace admin or mesh admin.
Yes.
We don't have service as another ACL granularity.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, you're right. So I do think you can add more flag in your design doc to say this policy is.
So
I think it's better to introduce it now.
Yes, I can add a section for that. I mean, for the MVP, I try to not adding that yet.
Yeah, implementation we can come later. Yeah,
but yes, that's good. I will add a section to mention that we can add a new flag for the prevent who can override the mesh or what level can override the policy.
Right.
So that is about override. The other side of the coins is, actually I mentioned it here, the override restrictions. We can add a field to say who can override or what can be overridden. But I haven't gone into detail about this much, but that makes sense. What I mean is about the conflict resolution as well. So when you have more, I mean, when you have like several policies, workload specific policy using label selectors, it's possible that they overlap. Some workload will be, I mean, it's overlap to some workload. For example, if you select on label app equal to full and some other policy put in the selector as I don't know, environment equal to prod. For some workloads that have label both full, label app equal to full and environment equal to prod, it'd be I mean, both of policies legally usable. We think we cannot provide a good solution for this because we don't know, in what context user want to define those policy for. So I think the simplest solution for now is just like using the newest one.
I think that's an incredibly bad idea. That's going to be
but
really
arbitrary because we cannot prevent them from adding those policy. We cannot doing the runtime check neither.
Yeah, but I mean, timestamp as the conflict resolution means that if I've got a config file that has a couple of different policies in it, and I just swap the order of them, then next time I deploy, I might get completely different behavior. Like that's going to be really, really confusing. Or if somebody like just touches one and like makes a trivial update, now suddenly it takes precedence. Like that's extremely fragile and unpredictable. I don't think timestamp is at all the way that we need to go here. We need to have something that is stable.
So maybe in that case, it's just like putting something to block the traffic. So it's kind of warning to user.
Like, I mean, ideally we should have things that can actually be composed. Like that's the whole the way that the Kubernetes API is sort of designed, is so that like configuration and policies are composable. If we really think that we can't compose them, then you can introduce an ordering field, or like a precedence kind of field, or even like a sort based on alphabetical name would be better than timestamp. Timestamp is like really far down the list of bad ways to do this conflict resolution.
Yeah, I try to find some way to sort them without user adding more information, right? I mean, precedent may save them, but like there's still a chance that people putting the same precedent for both policy. So
Yeah.
maybe sorting by name. I mean, it's just some consistent way. It doesn't have to pick the right one that they want, but it's just consistent, as you say.
Yeah,
The other way,
it needs to be consistent.
Yeah. The other way, maybe we can just have a namespace level CRD. Do not introduce the service level.
But how you define job for one service, for example?
No, you do have service-specific policies, but it's just defined in one namespace level CRD. Then you have ordered, right?
Yeah,
you basically
actually,
naturally order all the services.
Actually, it was one of the top. Actually, yeah, you're right. I think the reason we don't want to bundle in one is go back to the alignment with other
Selector.
Istio and selector concept. Right? If you bundle them, it looks the new CRD different from the rest of Istio API.
Yeah, but we need to do it case by case.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's easy to manage if you define different CRDs even in the same namespace. You have multiple CRDs, and then it's hard to order them. And if you're based on the timestamp, it's extremely hard.
Yeah, maybe sometimes it's a bad idea. I agree.
Yeah, and if even alphabetic is confusing. I think it would be really a good idea to combine them all in a single CRD. And then you can have this order. And then every time, whatever you change, if you don't change the order, the outcome will be deterministic. You don't need to go to different CRDs to see, oh, what's in this CRD, what's in that CRD, and then you write them down and then you order them. And that's really confusing. Right? Do you agree?
I agree, but I just wonder, like, I mean, that will make the thing look different from the normal way we introduce the API.
Yeah,
right?
I think
And it also means that you can't deploy a single service and have a self-contained manifest that has all the config for that service.
Yeah.
You mean make all the like security or other setting for one service in one CRD?
Yeah, I mean that's pretty typical way to deploy, right? Is that I've got a manifest that contains basically everything I need, right? It contains the deployment, it contains the network policy, it contains the service object, like all of these different objects that you need in order to deploy a service. You put them all in one manifest, and then you deploy that as a unit.
But if you do it in that way, the policies may conflict with other policies, and you don't know. After you deploy it, you will have to figure out the policy conflict.
Yeah. So I mean, Kubernetes network policy is designed in a way that they're composable. Calico policy is designed in a way where there's like a specific order parameter. Those are kind of the two different ways that that Kubernetes seems to handle these sort of policy things. So those are two sort of options that are in the field and working today. Is either you make them composable. If you can't make them composable, you introduce an order into the spec.
Yeah, I think those are good options.
If you have to define service level, maybe you may need to introduce something like order number to resolve the conflict.
Do you know what is spike? Could you explain a little bit more? Sorry, I I may not have enough background. What does composable mean here?
Meaning that the two policy objects, if they apply to the workload, then both policies apply, and there's no sort of inherent conflict in saying that both policies apply. So for example, Kubernetes network policy is allow only, right? You just have a list of things that are allowed, and so combining two lists of things that are allowed is very straightforward. There's no conflict there.
Okay.
So we can think more on this. We can make composable in the sense of, just apply the most secure one. But you need to have a definition of what is secure and what is not.
Yeah, exactly.
George is hard to say.
I know. That's why I try to avoid that way and think of this. It's a static core, right? We cannot solve everything at once. So
yeah,
figure out.
Is it? All right. Sorry. Yeah.
I can list the other option in this one and show for some background context of them. For the match conditions, the minimum is we need port or also the request path for job, for example. Today, the port is part of the target selector spec. But if you're just using the label to select workload, it's cleaner to move the port as part of the match conditions. So, and then we can add other L7 property like, request header, etc. So this is like kind of expandable later. In the beginning, which is like using a common attribute that we needed today, like port and path. Later, we can add other fancy stuff, and including some expressive language if you come to that way. So the structure is simply a list of attributes that, I'll come to the proposal later.
So these are all the conditions, right?
So
like
also
pass,
match.
If you match,
they have to be an AND. So within let me jump to the APIs, make it look cleaner. So the match proto is something like this, right? So within each repeated field here, within the repeated field is the is an OR and then AND across all of them. So you can list a bunch of ports that you want to apply have the policy affecting on, and a list of paths, but they have to be AND together. Is that
okay?
Make sense?
Okay.
I put here a required condition, but
so basically, sorry. So for the pause here, basically it's all the condition, repeated field. I saw a comment saying maybe consolidate with RBAC access rule. So if RBAC is on.
Yeah.
Like yeah.
No, I mean consolidate means using the same protocol as well.
Like either this 80 8080 or 1990.
Yeah.
Either this port or the other.
So the semantic is already the same, which is like the proto can be the same as well if we want to go to that part. So the required condition is something addition. It's halfway between authorization and authentication. We discussed about this in V1, and we think of make easier to do that in authorization. Just to give example, what is this? So we could have the use case that, for example, we want to use jot from Y, or if only the principal is X, or came from the trust domain Z, or some other condition of the peer authentications. So that is bit, it could be cleaner to put in the authentication layer instead of authorization, because it's not really authorized to access to some resource. It's just as a requirement of a combination for the principal or the credential presented for that request. I haven't had much talk on this yet, but I just list it here as an extra addition we may add into the V2 Does it make sense to you?
I mean, I guess what is the motivation for putting this stuff in authentication? Like the trust domain, for example. Like have we figured out how we're federating with other trust domains?
Oh, we kind of right. So, I mean, we want to for example, trust domain want to restrict. If you have a mesh, we use a Google CA, for example, so everyone can share the same root CA. So in theory, the different mesh can talk to each other.
Yeah, trust domain may be a better example here because as Spike said, we haven't figured out the story of cross mesh.
Yeah, especially I don't know how this will interact with the trust bundle, the SPIFFE trust bundle, because you are not mentioning the root key here.
No,
the root source here.
Yeah, maybe just the peers is a good example here. Let's focus on that.
Yeah. How about just leave this out for FV2 for now, because it's still like, it's a request from some security member here, but frankly, yeah, I don't see the clear use case yet.
Yeah, I want someone from SPIFFE side to see if this makes sense to them, because they are working on their trust bundle work. I don't want...
So I've been working on that
Okay.
with the SPIFFE team, and the kind of model that we have for how federation is going to work is at the level of the control plane, the identity control plane itself. So one kind of identity control plane will federate with another identity control plane and exchange their keys. And so in the kind of SPIFFE workload world, then when the workloads come up, they can get a trust bundle that that says, okay, well, here are all the keys that you should be able to authenticate against, and there has to be a sort of constraint placed on any of the federated keys to say, okay, well, these are only used to authenticate identities that are actually in that trust domain, right? It's not just a sort of, here's a set of keys that can authenticate any identity. So that's kind of how we were imagining that would work. I think that still fits relatively well into the model that we have in Citadel, where Citadel is sort of eventually responsible for presenting the validation context over SDS to the workloads.
But SDS currently doesn't have the trust domain, or like it doesn't have the pairing of the trust domain versus keys.
I think that we can accomplish that with X509 or with X509 constraints, like, or whatever it is, key constraints. So I'm hopeful that should be fine with existing libraries. Evan, oh, I see you're on the call. Do you know if we're going to be able to do that with key constraints, or whether it has to be some SPIFFE specific logic that enforces that identities from a foreign trust domain aren't signing for identities that they're not?
You're talking about X509 name constraint, URI name constraint?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, URI name constraints. Is that going to get us where we need to be for identity here?
Probably not.
Yeah, so the problems that we've run into is that the X509 URI name constraint isn't exactly widely implemented. And we've run into some software stacks that don't support it.
But in this case, we care about exactly one software stack, which is Envoy and Boring SSL.
Yes. So if name constraints are supported there, which I think that they are, then it should be fine. The SPIFFE specs have gone down a route of like trying to support as many softwares as possible, and so we recommend a different validation methodology. If you have name constraints, then it's okay, but you just have to be sure that when you're importing the foreign CAs that there's not a collision, a namespace collision.
Yeah. Yeah, what we are talking about here is through SDS to populate their Citadel node agent SDS to populate their trust bundles. Like basically the rules that your DM is defining here. Like from this peer, what trust domain you are allowed to authenticate. I see this is a little bit conflicting because this is defining in their authentication policy. And the TLS validation context that we are relying on is through the Citadel, which is not defined in the policies.
Right? Yeah, so I think we gotta, for specifically for the trust domain question, we gotta understand whether or not it really is a sort of authentication use case, whether specific service operators are going to get in the business of determining whether or not particular trust domains are considered authentic, or whether that's something that they sort of leave to the mesh administrator, saying, okay, well, we federated with this other trust domain, so like we're going to handle telling you whether or not those identities are authentic. I think it's a very separate question to say, will I accept those identities in the authorization layer? Like, are those identities from this other trust domain even authorized to access my service? But here we're asking the question: are these do we consider those other trust domains authentic, and is that something that we actually want to delegate down to service owners, or is that something that we're gonna say is determined at the mesh level?
Okay, that makes sense to me. So there are two levels. The trust bundle level is basic level that you can trust those ones. But on the service level, you can still specify your own policies to say, for my service, I only trust this trust domain, right? On top of their bottom level.
Yeah, and so I think we got to be a little more precise than just saying trust here, because there is this question of like authentication versus authorization. And so trust as in I believe that this authentically represents this foreign identity, or I am allowing this foreign identity to access my service.
Here, I think this is authentication policy.
In the previous design reviews for this design, there is a comment that this part we are discussing fall into the authorization. It's not exactly authentication.
It's like kind of in the gray area, right? It can do both, so it's just like where it's make easier for user to use.
Yeah. I think some people think it's authentication. Some people think
because some people think that the authentication is actually extract the identity, and whether this is allowed or disallowed.
I mean, the same concept. We can say authorization is allowed to access a resource, not to say checking what's the credential you use.
Yeah. No, I think there are two perfectly legitimate questions to ask. Is like, do I consider identities from this trust domain to be authentic, right? Do they really represent who they claim to be?
Right.
And a separate question is, after I've decided whether or not I consider them authentic, am I going to give them access? And so I think there is a legitimate authentication question around foreign trust domains, but I think that we got to decide, like I said, whether or not that's a question that service owners are going to be answering, or whether that's something that mesh operators are going to be answering around foreign trust domains.
Yep.
Yeah. So for this requirement thing, I mean, yeah, I agree. Trust domain may be a controversy example, but there are some other use case of like who can carry job or some other things. That's why we think it's better to have it here. For implementation, we can go more into detail of what exactly we're going to support.
Yeah, I think for jobs we have similar thing, right? if you are trusting the jot from other IDP identity providers, do you need to whitelist those IDPs?
Oh, George, we always whitelist the IDPs.
You always whitelist.
So
if you don't whitelist that, you don't trust. You don't think that jot is authentic, right?
Yeah.
So it's similar to the trust bundle, I guess.
Actually, the requirement here is saying, is this peer allowed to present this RC token?
Right. That's the upper level.
Yeah. So.
Right. After you think this jot is authentic, and then on top of that, whether your service allows that jot. That's another question.
No, not whether your service is this peer is the client. Whether this client peer allowed to present jot.
Yeah. Right. You're right. Yes. Whether the origin of the caller that calls to your service is allowed to present.
Yeah, we're talking about the peer here, right?
Yeah, the peer is the caller. Peer is source.
Okay.
It's the source identity.
Okay.
Because like so there's some use case of the token exchange, we want to limit who can actually make the token exchange instead of like getting from the internet, right?
Okay. Yeah.
In terms of trust domain, like in the authentication context, like you should know which trust domains are authorized, like through the authorization policy, right? Like, why do you have to separately specify trust domain, and then presumably there's authorization policy that includes trust domain ID, right?
Yeah, trust domain will definitely be in the authorization policy as well. But the question is, do we also need some kind of authentication?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, the sort of combination of peer and origin, like are certain peer and origin pairs allowed or not, I think is a gray area of whether that's an authentication question or an authorization question.
In terms of validation context, we can provide Envoy with validation context for all of the trust domains, right? And then just handle this at authorization layer purely.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of my my instinct as well, is to say, like, to have all this policy around, you know, what peers are allowed to present what origin identities and stuff like that, be an authorization decision. Although I do, you know, I am sympathetic to the idea that in some organizations that may be an indication of something inauthentic, right? Like that here we're worried about stolen credentials or something like that, and therefore it's an inauthentic request. But just because I feel like this sort of pairwise of like, how do you know, there could be tons of different peers and tons of different jots and stuff like that, it feels like you're getting into like a sort of deep rules-based policy, which authorization systems kind of already are set up to handle, rather than kind of adding all of this extra baggage around the authentication.
Yeah, I agree. I think we can just delay that part for future. It's not necessary. It's not like the important part of V2 change.
So what's the conclusion? So we will delay whether to have this trust domain in the authentication policy.
Have the whole required condition in the authentication policy.
It's the whole required.
Because Istio RBAC already supports this, right? Like you can assert in RBAC that you only want to allow a request if it came from a particular peer and came from a particular origin, right? You could do that sort of pairwise thing. Yeah. So I feel like unless we're getting really strong pushback that people don't like doing it in authorization, that we should leave it out and simplify the authentication piece for now.
That sounds good to me.
Cool. Actually, makes sense.
Simplify that's all about it. The API we still work on in progress, as name and the way we group them can change, and I'm open to all the suggestions for name, because I heard some feedback about like peer and origin is not very clear, and the way we using the layout, the structure is not it's look okay on Proto, but it's not look okay on YAML, etc.
Did the people that were complaining about peer and origin have other suggestions?
No, that's a problem.
Fair enough.
Everyone complained, but no one's even better.
Okay. I mean, we could talk about like channel versus like
request and
the request. I don't know.
I mean, one option is align them with the current attribute we already had in Istio. Like, so request could be like origin, because we use that to store the origin right now, and peer could be source. So it's like direct mapping from this thing to Istio attribute.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe request is not necessarily right either, because the request might not be the original request that was made. It's some other sort of secondary request that's being made on behalf of some end user, but it's not their actual request.
Yep.
I don't know. Yeah, exactly.
Origin may not be requested.
Yeah, I think we should just keep it unless somebody has like a concrete, like, no, this is what it should definitely be instead. Like, just say it's fine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my plan. I keep the thing origin until someone suggests a better thing that everyone agree. So in terms of implementation, we looking for start on this work right away. Hopefully get it into 1.2, even that is stress, but maybe 1.3 in be more certain. Any other questions?
All right. That's it. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you, everyone. All right. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.